all the ways that Jesus could have greeted the apostles on Easter Sunday, he chose 4 simple words: peace be with you. It can be easy to pass right over this greeting, but opening messages like this can tell us a lot. Remember, Jesus had just risen from the dead. He had just fulfilled his mission and paid a sacrifice for all of us. He had just overthrown the God of this world and took humanity out of a bad situation filled with bondage and suffering. Now the time had come to reveal himself to his closest friends. It was time to reveal their salvations and the miracle of the resurrection. So wouldn't you think he would say something far more important to mark this moment? Well, he didn't. He chose instead to offer an everyday greeting. Let's take a look at the peace Jesus offered his apostles to see how we can know the same peace in our hearts. The apostles were not in the most peaceful state. Not only had they seen Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, but they've also experienced their own weakness and lack of faith. Rather than hold on to his promise that he would rise again, they gave in to fear and doubt. Scattering at Jesus' arrest, they hung back during the trial and crucifixion. Then they went into hiding, worried that the authorities would soon be coming after them. And by all accounts, they'd failed Jesus. But when Jesus appeared, he didn't bring up the painful and embarrassing events of the past few days. He didn't even mention them. Instead, he just wished them peace. Peace be with you. Jesus' main goal was to show that he did not come into this world to condemn us, but to save us. He didn't want a relationship marked with vengeance, retribution, or anger. All he wanted was for us to be at peace. Now, the peace that had come from Jesus is not the same as the peace of this world. The world's peace depends on favorable circumstances, our getting our own way, things going as we expect, and maybe a few manageable problems. That sounds nice. But as soon as things go wrong, this type of peace tends to dissipate, leaving us anxious and fretful. Now, by contrast, the peace that Jesus brings helps us face troubling circumstances without becoming swallowed by the anxiety or anger or fear. It brings quiet confidence to our hearts that guides us as we face challenging situations. It's a peace that depends not on the events of our day, but on our love of Jesus. Now, Peter, the rock of the church, had denied even knowing Jesus. Now here he was on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, perhaps alone with Jesus for the first time since the resurrection. And all kinds of thoughts were probably swirling in his mind, and none of them positive. How could Jesus ever trust me again? Look how I failed him. But Jesus cut through Peter's guilt and shame by asking him one simple question: do you love me? He asked this question 3 times, in fact, leading Peter to admit, you know that I love you. Jesus didn't need to hear Peter say, I love you 3 times. Rather, Peter needed to say it over and over. He needed to see that despite his act of cowardice and denial, he honestly did love Jesus, and that was enough for our Lord. Peter didn't have to perform acts of atonement to set himself straight. Neither do we. He didn't need to remain locked in guilt. Neither do we. All he needed was to rediscover his love for Jesus. And so do we. When Peter learned this, he was finally at peace with himself, no longer bound up in guilt or anger over his failure. He was free to do what Jesus had called him to do. None of us will be perfect disciples. There may be days in a row when we disappoint Jesus or someone close to us. But we are so much more than the sum of our mistakes and failings. We are more than the sum of our successes and breakthroughs. Jesus isn't interested in reviewing all our past sins. He isn't interested in questioning all of our current motives. All He wants to do is point us to the love that we already have for Him, and we'll find our way to peace in our hearts. And the more peaceful we are, the easier it will be to fulfill His calling for us. Now finally, Jesus' gift of peace is meant to spill over into our relationships with each other. Immediately after telling the disciples, "Peace be with you," Jesus said, "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." Jesus is sending us out, asking us each to treat each other with the same mercy and love that He has shown us. It's mercy that pulls down the dividing walls of hostility, unforgiveness, and prejudice. It's love that empowers us to love each other deeply and be at peace with one another. Loving each other and forgiving each other is perhaps the most challenging aspect of our lives. We know how difficult it is to forgive someone who has hurt us. Our natural response is to lash out with anger, sink into guilt, or shrink back in resentment. The only way that we can overcome these patterns is to let peace reign in our hearts. If we can imagine what Peter and the others felt when Jesus stood before them, offering them unconditional forgiveness and endless friendship, we'll find our hearts softening. If we can imagine ourselves in their place, knowing that Jesus tells us, "Neither do I condemn you," you'll find grace to do the same with each other. If we can dedicate ourselves to living in love and mercy, we'll find ourselves more united with our friends, family members, and neighbors. We'll even find ourselves becoming more peaceful around the people who trouble us. Throughout His life, Jesus worked to remove the obstacles that keep us from knowing peace with the true God. Peace in our hearts and peace with each other. Let His words sink into your heart. Peace be with you.